On the morning of May 13th of 1862, Charleston Harbor looked like the last place on earth where freedom could possibly happen. The water lay under Confederate guns. Forts guarded the channels. Signal systems watched in the dark. Armed sentries studied every vessel moving in and out. And in the middle of all that trap sat a steamboat called the Planter, tied up beneath the headquarters of the Confederate generals, carrying guns, ammunition, and military information. It was not a pleasure craft. It was not some forgotten rowboat at the edge of a marsh. It was a working military transport in one of the most heavily guarded harbors in the South. On board stood Robert Smalls, a slave, a husband, a father, a harbor pilot, and a man who had reached the point where fear and necessity had finally become, let's say, business partners. Before the sun fully rose, he was going to take that vessel, collect his family, bluff his way past enemy fortifications, and hand the entire ship to the United States Navy. It sounds like a fever dream written by someone who got a little carried away. That's a clue as to how crazy this history is about to be. To understand how impossible this whole thing is, you have to understand who Robert Smalls was before that morning. He had been born in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1839, of course, at that time into slavery. His mother, Lydia, worried that he was getting a lot of favoritism, and because he worked close to the house and was favored more than others, he might grow up without fully understanding the brutality of the system around him. So she sent him to the fields, and she wanted him to witness the whippings and maybe even experience some of his own, because she feared comfort might make him forget suffering. That is a brutal sentence to sit with, but it tells you everything about the world that he was born into and the kind of life he had to live. As a boy, he was hired out in Charleston, where he labored into different jobs and slowly found his way into the waterfront. There he worked as a longshoreman, a rigger, a sailmaker, and eventually as a wheelman, which that was effectively the man that was doing the job of a helmsman without being given the title of helmsman. A slave could steer the vessel. He could know the currents. He could memorize the channel. He could read the moods of the harbor and still not be fully acknowledged as the man performing the task. That title belonged to the white man. The responsibility could be dumped on anybody useful. Smalls was a very smart man. Smalls learned every inch of the Charleston Harbor under that arrangement. He used all of this to his own advantage. He learned the tides, the shoals, the signal patterns, the routines of officers, and the habits of a place that believed itself to be secure. It was an education that was forced out of injustice, but would be one day a very useful weapon if he used it right. He also had a family, and that matters more than people sometimes realize when they tell a story like this as if it was some kind of a stunt. This was not a stunt. This was a rescue mission. Robert had married a woman by the name of Hannah Jones. She was also a slave. She changed her name, of course, to Hannah Smalls. And together they built a life in the cramped, unstable, and humiliating space that they were given. They had children. They had debts. They had a future hanging over them like a judge's hand. And Robert desperately wanted to buy freedom for his family, and he saved every penny that he could, but the cost was staggering. He had managed only a small fraction of what would be needed. At the rates things were going, he could have spent years, maybe decades, trying to purchase what never should have been sold in the first place: his own children. Then the Civil War began, and suddenly that same harbor that had trapped him also offered him information. He was assigned to the Planter, the Confederate military transport used for moving troops, messages, artillery, and even supplies. That meant that Smalls was no longer just near the machinery of war. He was inside it. He piloted the ships around Charleston Harbor and beyond. He saw the forts. He saw the blockade. He saw which officers were careless, which ones were strict, when the ship docked, when the men went ashore, and what would have to happen for some kind of an escape to work. Most men could have noticed all of that and still have done absolutely nothing about it. But Robert Smalls noticed it and began building a plan so insane that even hearing it laid out today makes you stop and say, "Sir, perhaps choose a less fatal hobby?" But here's where the difficulty becomes almost absurd. Smalls was not planning to slip away in darkness on some tiny boat hugging reeds and praying not to be spotted. He intended to take a Confederate military vessel out of the Charleston harbor itself. That meant getting past armed checkpoints, passing under guns of multiple forts, correctly responding to challenges, and somehow not drawing fire from either side before he reached safety. If a sentry recognized his face, the game was over. If he missed a signal, the game was over. If the engine coughed at the wrong moment, the game was over. If one frightened child cried out, if one crewman panicked, if one officer happened to return unexpectedly, if one harbor watchman decided to take his job unusually seriously for once in his natural-born life, the game and their lives were over. And then there was the matter of appearance. The officers of the planter were white, and they left the ship at night. Smalls knew that from a distance, especially in dim light, posture and confidence could sometimes do as much work as a face. So when the chance came, he put on the captain's clothing and wore a straw hat like the one that the white captain was known for wearing. That detail sounds small until you realize it might have saved every life on board. This was theater performed at gunpoint, and Charleston Harbor was the audience. The chance finally came on the night of May 12th. The planter had returned to Charleston after carrying guns and ammunition. The officers all went ashore for the evening, leaving the slaved crew aboard, which they had done before, and therefore they did not consider it especially dangerous. But that was their first fatal mistake, though not fatal for them in the way they had feared. Before leaving, one of the officers even approved a request that the crew's family come aboard to visit. That made things easier, though easier here is doing some pretty heroic labor. The women and children arrived, and only then did some of them fully realize what was about to happen. Several of them were terrified. Some of them cried, some panicked, quite reasonably, because their husbands were not proposing a quiet relocation. They were proposing mass death with a side of a chance and a possibility of freedom. But Hannah Smalls did not retreat. She told Robert that she and her children would go, and that if he died, she would die beside him. There are moments in history where the scale of risk gets so large that the language becomes almost embarrassing in trying to keep up. And this is one of them. These people were not gambling for adventure. They were bettering their lives. They were bettering their children's lives against a system that had already proven that it would and could absolutely crush them without remorse, given the chance. At around 3 a.m, the planter eased away from the dock. The ship was not racing. They didn't move fast. They couldn't. Racing would invite scrutiny. It had to move like it belonged there. Smalls stood where the captain stood. He had to mimic not just the role, but a whole pattern of authority. The crew had to behave like a crew. The women and children had to stay quiet and hidden. First, they moved to pick up the waiting family members at another point along the waterfront, and then they turned toward the harbor mouth. Ahead lay the Confederate forts. Each one was a possible death sentence. This was not just one checkpoint. It was a chain of them. They had to pass Castle Pinckney, then Fort Johnson, and then the rest of the harbor defenses, and then finally Fort Sumter itself, the giant name looming over the entire war. Smalls knew the proper whistle signals because he'd spent enough time being useful to these men that he had to learn how all of these men had passed safely through their own defenses. Every signal he gave had to be exact, not close, not nearly right, but exact. And every time the ship moved forward after one of those checkpoints, the tension must have tightened rather than eased, because success only carried them to the next test, and the next test was just going to be that much more difficult. Fort Sumter was the great trial. If anything was going to go wrong, it was likely going to go wrong there. The fort was armed and alert, and symbolic, far less forgiving than some sleepy dockside sentry whose only ambition before sunrise was to get a fresh cup of coffee and a few responsibilities. As the planter approached, the challenge signal came. Smalls answered. Then there was a pause. That pause, by itself, could probably take 10 years off of a person's life, not to mention the gray hairs it might add. Imagine standing there dressed like a man you're not allowed to be, with your wife, your children, your neighbors, your co-workers, everybody that you care about is hidden on board. They're waiting to see whether the next sound will be permission or death in the form of cannon fire. And one of the remarkable things about this story that so often gets told briskly, as though the ship simply floated out. It did not simply float out. It passed through a tightening funnel of danger that required discipline, memory, nerve, and the kind of self-control most of us can't even maintain in a grocery store line when somebody forgets where they left their wallet when they're standing in line ahead of us. And then Fort Sumter let them pass. But even then, they were not safe. After bluffing their way through Confederate lines, after doing the near impossible and reaching open water, they still could have been blown apart by Union blockades. From the point of view of the United States ships outside of the harbor, a Confederate transport was heading toward them in dim light. This is not the sort of thing that people would greet with flowers and polite clarifying questions. Oh, hi, how are you? Can you tell us who you are and what you're doing here? They were preparing to fire. And what saved the ship was not some elegant naval banner prepared in advance, but a plain white bedsheet brought by Small's wife, which was raised as a surrender flag. That's one of those details so humble it almost sneaks past you. This was a bedsheet. It was an ordinary household object, something domestic, private, associated with sleep and shelter. And this became the signal that transformed a war prize from a target to a triumph. When Union officers finally boarded, Robert Smalls reportedly greeted them by saying he had brought them, and I quote, some of the old United States guns, end quote. I don't care how serious of a historian you are. This is spectacular. He had not only delivered the vessel, he had delivered artillery, ammunition, code signals, and priceless knowledge of Charleston's harbor defenses. In a single act, one now former slave had humiliated the Confederacy, enriched the Union, and liberated his entire family and several of his neighbors. The United States Navy quickly recognized how valuable Smalls was. The planter was taken into United service in the Union, and Smalls became indispensable as a pilot because he knew the waters intimately. He guided Union operations, helped identify and avoid mines, and served in combat situations where local knowledge could mean the difference between victory and disaster. During one action, when the planter was under fire and its captain effectively lost its nerve, Smalls took command and brought the vessel to safety. That led to his being made captain of the planter in practice. And he's widely remembered as being the first black man to command a United States ship. Even that achievement was tangled in the country's refusal to grant black competence due to the racial separations at the time. He didn't receive the dignity that he deserved. His precise commission status later became a mess of paperwork, military bureaucracy, and the general American habit of trying to enjoy black heroism without fully paying for it. But the reality on the water was clear. Men trusted him. The vessel moved under his command. He had taken the wheel in war and proven once again that the system had always relied on skills it pretended not to see. And if that were the end of his life, it would already be enough for 3 biographies and an overconfident miniseries. He had really lived. But Robert Smalls did not end as a wartime antidote. After the war, he returned to Beaufort, and he purchased the very house in which he and his mother had once been held in slavery. It's hard to think of a more direct act of historical reversal than that. He taught himself to read and write. He went into business. He helped found a railroad. He served in the South Carolina legislature and later in the United States House of Representatives. He fought for public education, civil rights, black political participation, and the protection under the law. He became a major figure in Reconstruction, one of those men who tried to build an actual democracy in the ruins of slavery, which much of the country was busy deciding it preferred myth to justice. He also suffered for it. His opponents harassed him. His military pension and status became the subject of ugly resistance. The same nation that could admire his bravery still hesitated whether equality stepped into the room and asked to be seated properly. Even so, he kept going. Later in life, he was still using his influence locally to prevent mob violence and protect black citizens from being murdered. He did not seize freedom for himself and then just have a seat. He spent his life insisting that freedom should be real. And you know that house he bought, where he and his mother had been slaves before? Well, when the old lady who had been living in that house when he was a small child got old and got dementia, he allowed her to move back into the house, and he and his family took care of her. That's an incredible amount of love, selflessness, and forgiveness. But there's another reason that this story lands so hard. Robert Smalls did not begin as a man with institutional power, formal authority, elite schooling, or even legal control over his own wages. He began as a slave in a world built to deny him any sense of real humanity. Yet when the moment came, he observed more carefully, judged more correctly, and acted more courageously than the men who claimed the right to own his life. The Confederates trusted his skill, but not his personhood, and that blindness cost them a ship. The Union welcomed his help, but still struggled to reward him without hedging and delaying or fumbling into prejudice. And still he rose. That's what makes his story feel almost too large. It's not merely that he escaped, it's that he escaped brilliantly, then lived afterward in a way that proved that escape was not a lucky burst of nerve from one desperate night. It was the expression of a disciplined, extremely intelligent, forceful man who had been underestimated for years. Robert Smalls sailed out of Charleston Harbor as property under the law and into history as something far more dangerous to the old order. He was proof. He was proof that there was life after slavery. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What do you think took more courage? Was it that one impossible dawn in Charleston Harbor, or the long decades afterward when Robert Smalls had to keep fighting for dignity in a country that was willing to praise his heroism faster than it was willing to honor his humanity? It's taken a long time to get to where we are, but we're not there anymore. And of course, as always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and people. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Remember, every subscriber helps. Thank you for watching.